Welcome back to another episode of Good Time Bikes, sponsored by Richard's Bicycles. And you might notice that I'm currently surrounded by Schwinn Stingray parts. And that's because this is the video that brings everything back together. I'll also cover my wheels, grips, and my pedals, but some of those I'll only touch lightly on because it has to do with rust removal, which I've covered in previous videos. And if you keep watching, I have big plans for this bike, and there's going to be a big reveal toward the end. And some of you might think I'm a little crazy for doing it, but you're going to find out what it is. So let's get started. Let's discuss what parts I had to order. I have my new tires up top. The front wheel, that's the one on the left, I had to order that, and that's because the wheel that came with the bike for the front wheel was incorrect. The middle wheel, that one is original to the bike. And you'll notice that beautiful front fender, I had to order that as well. And oh, look at those nasty pedals that I'm going to have to cover in this video as well. And there's that beautiful seat that I recovered in episode 2. I'm also still waiting for a fork and my rear reflector. But for right now, let's get started on these wheels. Okay, so I'm just starting with the obvious, removing my tire, inner tube, and the nasty old rim strip that came with this wheel. And from there I'll remove the axle and bearings, and I'll also remove the hardware, which those are actually called cone nuts. And you'll notice I used a cone wrench to do so. That's just a small, thin wrench that fits through the slot on the hardware. If you don't know what cone wrenches are, some of you may not, it'll be helpful to have one for this project. Now, when it comes to delacing a wheel, I like to start by just loosening up all the nipples with my spoke wrench. Also take notice that different bikes require different spoke wrenches. They are color-coded, and mine happens to require the green one. That's the best fit. Once all the nipples are nice and loose, I like to come in with an electric screwdriver with a flat blade on it, and that makes this job go by so much faster. Now once we slide all of these spokes out of this hub, everything will be separated finally, and then it's time to move on to cleaning and polishing. Let's start with the spokes, and the first thing I had to do was to straighten each spoke individually because so many of them were bent. Next, I inserted one end of the spoke into the drill and tightened it down. Don't tighten it too much because if the threads of the spoke are inside the drill, you don't want to damage them. Next, I spray the spoke with WD-40, pull the trigger on my drill, and run my steel wool up and down the spoke. After a handful of passes with the WD-40, I wipe the spoke down with an old shop towel. Now it's time to pretty much repeat this process, but this time I'm going to use a microfiber towel and polish. You can use whatever product you like, but I'm a big fan of Blue Magic. Okay, and now it's time to take the spoke out of the drill, flip it around, and do the other side. And I'll let you in on a little secret. While I was cleaning the spokes and nipples, I was actually watching some interesting documentaries on YouTube. And once I had this portion done, I did come back and do the head of the spoke, or the little J-bend portion, by hand. I hope you can tell on the camera, but what a difference. This is the outcome I was looking for, and I'm very satisfied with it. And of course we're not going to stop there, so let's move on to the nipples. Okay, so it's basically the same process we did with the spokes, only this time you take the nipple and you screw it onto a spoke, and you make sure that the drill is turning to the right. That way the nipple doesn't unscrew from the spoke. And one of the things I noticed while I was doing this is that on the flat portions of the nipple, there was actually some buildup of dirt that I had to scrape away. And after that, I went over it one more time and they came out looking great. By the way, if you want to make quick work of the axle and axle nuts, you can put those in the drill as well. Look at the difference in the before and after, from dirty and dull to shining like brand new again. And what do you know? It's after 4:30 in the morning. I guess I got a little carried away with all the cleaning and polishing. Okay, it's the next day and I am ready to put this thing back together. The rim and hub I actually cleaned off camera. They were both a little rusty, but not too severe. I used Eastwood's rust dissolver on the rim, and I tried an experiment with lemon juice. I heard that worked really well, and that's what I used on the hub, and it turned out great. Now, this isn't meant to be a wheel building tutorial, but for those of you who are going to do it yourself, I'd like you to know that this is a 3-cross pattern, and it's over, over, over. Now that this is looking like a wheel again, let's take a look at what it used to look like. All rusty and crusty. It's looking a whole lot better, and while this might not be the easiest process in the world, it really is very satisfying, and it does pay off. All there is left to do now is to pack the bearings, throw the axle in, and true this wheel up. And by the way, I'm a big fan of the Park tool grease. That's what I prefer for headset bearings, hubs, and bottom brackets. This wheel's come a long way, and while it's not covered in diamonds, some of you might agree it looks like jewelry. Well, to us bike guys it does anyway. Now let's not stop there. We got a whole rear wheel to do, so let's take a look at that next. Oof. Rust, rust, and more rust. Well, we know how to handle that, so let's get the tire taken off, get this wheel unlaced, and start with our 2-speed kickback hub, and see what's inside that thing. But wait, for those of you who think I'm a 2-speed kickback guru, I'm not. I've never built one of these in my life. And while this isn't going to be a tutorial, I would like to share with you what it looks like on the inside, and some pointers that could help you if you're looking to tackle this on your own. Remember to work slowly and take a lot of pictures. So if you're still with me on this, let's proceed. That's a lot of parts. Are those broken? What is that? Ugh, gross. How bad could it be? Okay, it looks like a war zone for toy soldiers. But let's get this cleaned up with some of the techniques from previous videos, along with brake cleaner for all the parts covered in grease, and then see what we have. Well, things are looking a little bit better now, a lot cleaner and a little bit more organized, but before we go any further, I'd like to show you exactly what I did with this hub. First, I'd like to say I'm lucky because most of this is dirt, so once I rinsed it and dried it, this is what I was left with. So next it was time to get the remaining rust off. So I soaked it in lemon juice overnight, rinsed it off the next morning, dried it carefully, and as you can see, it didn't damage the blue bands at all, despite the paint on those being 56 years old. Another thing I'd like to point out are the diagrams that are available on the internet. This actually made my job of assembling this hub a whole lot easier. But first I put it together on a dry run, so no grease at all. And then I took it apart and went back, added the Park tool grease, and finished the final assembly. And this way I was sure to put it back together properly. Before we move on, I'd like to point out that the front wheel, while that was a 3-cross pattern, over, 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 my rear wheel happened to be a 2-cross pattern, which was over, over. And regardless of what bike you're working on, this is something you should always pay attention to before disassembling the wheels. Now that my wheels are fully assembled, it's time to take a look at these pedals. A lot like the rest of this bike when I got it, these pedals are all the same. Rusty, dirty, and the grease that was inside of them, well, that's long since dried up. And the worst part about these pedals is that they're non-serviceable. That's right, they were never meant to be taken apart and re-greased. And I know what you're thinking. There's a nut on there, just unscrew the nut, it'll be fine. Well, I did that, and I broke the nut free, but it spins perpetually. It never comes off. And though there's one nut shape on one side, on the other side, it's just circular, almost rivet shaped. So it really was never meant to be disassembled. But with a little help from my friends on the Stingray Facebook groups, I was off in the right direction. And it was time to get creative. Yep, it was time to break out my safety glasses and my 3-inch cutoff wheel. A Dremel tool will work also, but what you want to do is cut through the nut just enough to be sure to remove it. You don't want to cut into the pin, and that's the mistake that I actually made. So once I had these pedals disassembled, I actually had to take the pins, weld them to build up material, and then I was able to cut new threads into them using a die. Next thing for these parts is to be soaked in gas to get rid of the grease, and then soaked in lemon juice to get rid of the rust. And these are all techniques that I've covered in previous videos. And now it's time for the pedal blocks. These things are so nasty and caked up, I'm really surprised how nice they came out. But this was easy enough. I let them soak in Simple Green for about 24 hours and then scrubbed them with a toothbrush. Ooh-wee, look at that. And before we forget, we gotta move on to doing these threads for the pins, so let's get that started. Now I did what any guy would do, and I tracked down the cheapest tool and die set I possibly could, and that means it was off to Harbor Freight. Now I don't recommend it, but I gotta say it did get the job done. Now because I only spent $20 on my tool and die set, it turns out that there was only one die that would actually fit. It was 12 by 24, which is an oddball size, so I had to order the hardware off of eBay. Also, if you've never cut threads before, there are a lot of great videos on YouTube on how to do this. And you know what? After welding, grinding, and cutting new threads into all 4 pins, this looks really good, and I'm happy with the outcome. And now it's time to pull our pedal parts out of the lemon juice and see what those look like. And yep, those are super clean as usual. And remember, don't pull these parts out of the lemon juice until you're absolutely ready to move on to the next step to avoid flash rust. Once I was done with the lemon juice, I rinsed it in water, used an air compressor and an air gun to dry it, and then I was off to the benchtop grinder with the wire wheel. And this is one tool that speeds the process up exponentially because it levels off all the high points in the pitted metal. And as for the next step for these parts, it's time for the buffer. This is a great little machine from Eastwood Tools. They also sell all the buffing wheels and compounds you'll need, and Eastwood is great for answering any questions you have. They even have their own YouTube channel with demonstrations. And now that you know how wonderful Eastwood is, it's time to move on to the next step, where we grease these pedals. And there's no doubt this gets messy, but it's the same technique you would use to re-grease the bearings on an old car. You basically push the grease into the area you want, and if you do it repeatedly, the grease will eventually work its way in between the ball bearings. Once I was finished with the outside of the pedal, I moved on to the inside bearing. And while it's a little tighter, it works all the same. And once I was done with that, I wiped the excess grease off, cleaned it up with alcohol, and finished up with Blue Magic metal polish. And after a dab of Loctite for each nut, it was time for a quick assembly. And in case you forgot how bad these pedals were, take a look. Also, I know some of you polish them to a mirror finish, but that's not what I was going for. I wanted to keep them a little more toned down than that. So what do you guys think? To me, they look really good and I'm super happy with the outcome. But if you guys would have done something differently, don't be afraid to let me know down in the comments. And now that I have the pedals finished up, it's time to move on to a pair of grips that have seen better days. And yeah, look at these things. For as nasty as they are, I have a couple of techniques that'll turn these nasty old grips into something looking close to brand new, and it'll make a quick and easy project. So let's get started. As usual, I like to start off by soaking the grips in Simple Green overnight and then scrubbing them with a toothbrush the next day. And now that they're nice and clean, let's see what we can do about that color to make them a little bit whiter. Yep, bleach, dish soap, and a little bit of water if you want to top it off. This is another helpful technique that I got off of the Stingray Facebook pages. While it did a decent job at making it a little bit brighter, it wasn't as white as I wanted. And one of the downfalls of doing it this way is that it took multiple days to see a difference. So there's a second technique I'd like to show you that's a little bit more in-depth, but it definitely provides for better results. So for this technique, you'll need plastic wrap, a small brush, a black light or a UV light, same thing, and for our main ingredient, Salon Care 40. I was actually able to purchase mine off of eBay. As you can see here, I already have my saran wrap laid out with the grip on it. Next, I pour the Salon Care 40 on top of the grip. I use my brush to spread it around on the grip evenly and make sure it's fully covered, and after that, I wrap it in the saran wrap. With both of the grips coated and wrapped in plastic wrap, it's time to set them up with our black light. And here's an important detail. Space your grips out. You don't want them too close to the light because it gets hot, and you don't want any dark spots or anything to melt. These grips have come a long way, especially compared to what they used to look like. and I'm really happy with the outcome. So now that I have these grips finished up, I think it's finally time to get this bike put back together. So let's get started on that. That was a lot of information, and that's the most information I've put into one video yet, but it took forever for me to get it recorded, edited, and posted. Now, what took me so long? Sure, I was waiting on parts that were over 5 decades old, and we all know how hard it is to find the right part in the right condition at the right price, because these things can get really pricey really fast, am I right? But that's not what held me up. Turns out I actually got hurt. It was an injury in relation to my spine, and the doctor told me I need back surgery. So I found a way to avoid back surgery. I learned about regenerative medicine, and I went to a place called the Illinois Back Institute, and that's a place that actually pulls your spine apart. I know it sounds torturous, but it actually worked wonders for me. So I'd like to discuss some of the things that I would have changed or done differently on this project, and I think most of all, I would have preferred to use lemon juice when it came to derusting, rather than using any sort of derusting chemical, which the chemicals work great, but I prefer lemon juice, 1, because it's natural, and 2, because it's so much cheaper. Sure, it's organic, so it's not going to last as long as some of the chemicals, obviously, but it does the job that I'm looking for. And secondly, I would have loved to have had parts re-chromed, but once I looked into the price of getting things re-chrome plated, it was more than I was willing to spend. Also, I did use some brand new modern parts on here, obviously the tubes and the tires, but also the rear reflector, that's a remake, and I had to go with a brand new chain, because all of the 1960s chains that I was coming across all had cracked links, and I didn't want to deal with that, so I went ahead with a new single-speed chain. Also, you'll notice that I mounted the fork and the crank off camera. And don't forget, I have a big announcement coming up at the end of this video, something super exciting, and it's in relation to what I'm going to do with upcoming videos on this bike. One more thing I'd like to mention is that my project is exactly like your project at home. There are hurdles to overcome. With any project, there are trials and tribulations, but we don't let that stop us. So get out to the shed, get out to the garage, and get your bike back on the road. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm assembling my team, and I'm getting my bike put back together. Bike mechanics, assemble! No? No. Just me. Okay. You know, it's been a lot of fun restoring this old bike, and it's even more fun to ride. And speaking of riding, that reminds me, it's time to reveal my big announcement. And that is, I'm going to ride this 1966 Schwinn Stingray down a hill at 40 miles an hour. If you think I'm crazy and that's super fast, let me know down in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to catch the courageous act of me riding this bike down a hill at 40 miles an hour on the next episode. I'll see you next time. 40 miles an hour. Why did I think that's a good idea?